community, and welcome to today's live session. We're here to dive into a critical topic, mental health and procurement, and how to combat burnout in our fast paced industry. As many of you know, May is Mental Health Awareness Month, and we're thrilled to have Tom Mills with us today. Tom has been very vocal about burnout and procurement, sharing his own experiences and strategies for resilience. Tom, thanks for joining.
It's so good to be here, and I'm so glad, Kim, that we're talking about probably the most important topic when it comes to procurement, because it's something that is absolutely prevalent, I think, and we need to be talking about it more.
Great. I totally agree. So let's jump in. Tom, you've written about burnout and procurement before. What sparked your focus on this topic?
Yeah, I think so. I've got a very personal experience whereby I've had 20 or so years in both direct and in indirect procurement roles. And when I made the transition into indirect procurement, oh my goodness, the jump that was in terms of the difference, in terms of having to influence stakeholders and having to learn new skills, but also the pressure in terms of there's just so much on, so many different competing pressures. It actually led to, I'd say, more than just burnout for me. I actually had a period of, which I only realized in retrospect, generalized anxiety disorder. So I actually got to the stage where, to put it into perspective, I would literally not be able to think about anything other than work. Every single waking second was thinking about work, such that it actually impacted my personal relationships. It stopped me enjoying life. And I think when it gets to that stage, then something's gone really wrong. So I have a real personal experience with it. And it was only through going through that experience that I realized that while there were probably multiple competing things that led to that, procurement, the role, the pressures of procurement was actually a key factor. So that's why I wanted to be talking about it more, and I think we should too.
I 100% agree. I have also been there myself. So I think everyone has a story around burnout within their career at some point or another. And so, very excited to talk to you about this today. What early signs do you feel are out there that procurement professionals, especially, should watch out for when it comes to burnout?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one on early signs because actually, I think most procurement people who are watching this or listening to this will actually feel like, well, hang on a minute, I'm always feeling busy. There's always things to do. But I think it's when you absolutely lose perspective and you lose that balance, when you're not absolutely able to switch off. And you know that whole thing of when you kind of when every waking hour you're thinking about work and you're not able to switch off. And then the other thing for me was, and a big sign was that actually I was feeling more and more tired, but sleep was less and less helpful, if that made sense. So I was having really broken night's sleep, despite the fact that I was feeling exhausted. I felt completely exhausted all of the time. And then the other thing that was very specific to me was as I got more and more stressed, the harder I worked. So it was almost like the treadmill, almost being a hamster on a wheel and going faster and faster, but more and more, it became more and more stressful. So I think that feeling of when you feel like you're losing control and you're just literally just firefighting day in, day out, those were the warning signs for me. And I know it's very personal, it's very specific.
No, I mean, thank you for sharing that. I totally relate to that. I have been there myself. I've had, for me, I've experienced with anxiety. I get very anxious when I get burnt out, and I start to stress about everything and thinking I'm not going to meet this deadline, or oh my gosh, am I properly prepared for this or that? And I feel like it's just such a relatable topic that we've all been there. And we've all been overwhelmed at some point in our career. So, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to jump in. I remember that because there was something you just said then.
Mhm.
I remember there was one specific meeting that I had to attend. It was an early morning meeting on a Monday. There were quite a lot of senior stakeholders in it. And honestly, it was a 2 hour meeting. I had just two slides to present, and they were quite simple slides, just talking about the procurement process and what we'd just been through. And honestly, the anxiety around that was just unbelievable to the extent that I don't know if anyone noticed in the room, but I literally could not. It felt like just reading through those slides was the most difficult thing in the world. So, when the simple tasks become really difficult, a lot of this comes from childhood because ultimately, you know, there's that conscientious guilt. I want to do things well. In procurement, it's all about quality. We want to prove ourselves to our stakeholders. We have big pressures. But for me, just going back to the warning signs bit, sometimes you just know when things aren't right, they're not normal.
Yep, 100% agree. What strategies would you recommend when people are feeling that way that we can utilize to help and, feel better and maybe not feel so anxious?
Yeah, well, one of the things that was, and I know this sounds really common, but I just really did think it was just me. So actually, um, one of the things compelled me to actually start writing on LinkedIn, for example, was because I wanted to share openly because I realized the more I shared, the more it resonated, and the more I realized I wasn't alone. So sometimes the downside of things like anxiety or burnout is you can feel quite isolated. And
Mhm.
one thing that I would say fundamentally, and I know this applies to many kind of mental health challenges, is opening up and finding someone to talk to. So I remember the first time that I spoke to someone in the HR team in the business that I worked at, and they actually identified that maybe I was suffering from stress and maybe I needed help, was the first time that I actually thought, oh, maybe this isn't me. Maybe this is actually something that I'm suffering from. Maybe this isn't about me. This is just something I need to get help for. And then, secondly, as a result of my generalized anxiety disorder, once I'd identified that, I actually got some counseling and got some cognitive behavioral therapy. And I used that and actually had created from that some frameworks that I now teach as part of my procurement soft skills mastery course around frameworks for dealing with things like difficult conversations or dealing with non-compliance or um, preparing for negotiations. And I think that ability to separate yourself and create a process to see yourself through it has really helped me. So yeah,
Yeah, no, that's great. I myself, for you shared something so personal, so I'll share as well. For me myself, I also ended up going to some counseling. It was actually more of a
yeah,
life coach, but I
yeah,
really needed some help pushing me through some of the anxiety that I had and just the overwhelming stress that I was feeling. Just I can be somewhat type A and put a lot of pressure on myself. And
yeah,
so I noticed that coming out in work and just in even my normal day life. I do think it's such a big thing nowadays, and something that I do think people are more comfortable talking about now than they used to be. It's not as taboo of a topic. And so, what can organizations do? I can tell you for procurability, we do a lot for mental health awareness month. In fact, it just kicked off today, May 1st, and I have already received an email in my inbox of all the activities that we're going to have for the month of May to help us with our stress. One of them was, I think it was called Deskercise. So it was like a like desk dance class. So there's just little things like that Procurability does to really help us, kind of take that moment during the day to stop, pause, think about our mental health, see how we're feeling, and help us through the day. So what can organizations do?
Oh, I mean, procurability sounds like a great culture and that you've got that focus. And I am going to just shout out Bibby Financial Services, which was the last business that I worked in, which were absolutely brilliant when it came to mental health and such that they would focus on things like, for example, making sure that people got daily exercise. There was kind of running groups that were set up. There was kind of a big emphasis on accessibility to things like mental health first aiders, and I actually became trained and became a mental health first aiders because I felt my experience was useful to others. So I think businesses themselves can take responsibility, but actually I think a lot of it comes down to line management and coaching around line managers and how your people manager looks after you. And I remember one specific example with my CFO that I reported into when I decided to go for a run because I just needed to. And that feeling I got back and I thought, I've got two missed calls, and you feel almost that guilt of, oh my
Mhm.
goodness, what's he going to say? I haven't been contactable. And I thought, you know what, I'm just going to be honest and say I went for a run. And I remember it was a game-changing moment for me, because he said, "Good, that's brilliant. In fact, you've reminded me I'm going to do the same." And for me, just that awareness that sometimes people just need to be able to be given that latitude and that freedom to be able to just do something for their health, as well as
Yeah.
just being constantly on. Does that make
Oh,
sense?
that completely makes sense. And I've been there myself, I mean, being able to just, we're open at Procurability, and I do think that we have that culture here where, you can say, I went for a run. A lot of people at Procurability are very active runners, mountain
Yeah,
bikers, rock climbers. And so they're always talking about the things that they do, and the activities that they do. And I think it helps show that we have this balance, right? You have your work, but then you also have your personal life, and you have to be able to balance them, or you're going to get burnout, and that's definitely going to start to creep in.
yeah,
So I think, companies that can do that and fit that into their culture are definitely on the edge of what it means to be successful in an organization. We're getting a bunch of questions, and so I just wanted to just quickly ask one because it was pertinent to the
yeah.
conversation that's happening. But if the workplace doesn't have any support structures in place for coping with burnout, what would you suggest doing to help start creating that change within that organization?
Well, this is a really great question, because, and I'm going to say to Liz, who's asked the question, I'm not sure there's a super simple answer to this, because actually driving cultural change as an individual can be quite tricky. But I go back to my point around talking and being open. And I think that perhaps making sure that you can find maybe two or three individuals within your organizations that you trust to be able to have a really clear, confidential conversation around, this is how I'm feeling. These are where I believe the gaps are in the organization. And actually, this is what it could do to help maintain and retain our talent. Thinking about it from a business perspective, because I think there's a real cost to burnout. If you think about the cost in terms of people losing days, people's health, people wanting to leave, and actually translating it into a bit of a business case so that you can almost not just look at it from a people angle, but also looking at it from a business angle. But I would say talking openly, discussing the issues, and from maybe finding three or four people who you might be able to have that confidential conversation with to say, actually, I think as a business, we need to be doing more about this.
I think that that's a great idea. And going back to, burnout and the financial impacts, being that I'm the director of talent at Procurability, and so I work with recruiting, and so retention is huge. I think Procurability, like I said, does a great job. But as we're recruiting and I talk to other candidates within the market, I do talk to a lot of candidates that are leaving companies or looking for a new role because they are so burnt out and they
Yeah,
don't have ways to cope, and they're just looking for, the opportunity to go to a company that has that type
yeah,
of culture.
yeah, yeah. I will say there will be a time, and I know this might not be a popular thing to say, but there will be a time that there are just some businesses which are not going to change. And, you've got to be careful, whereby, in my view, and I know job insecurity is a big thing at the moment, but you've always got to think, what is the cost to me, my relationships, my health, my life, in terms of the culture that I'm in. So I think obviously me and you, Kim, are in an advantageous position whereby we work for companies who, or have worked for companies who are great. But I think if you've had those conversations, you really feel like it's impacting on your life, and you really feel like there's no desire for the organization to change, and then you've got to think inwardly about, okay, what what do you what are you going to do to try and move your career in a direction whereby it no longer has such a negative impact?
Yep, absolutely. I know in procurement roles, it's one of those departments within a company that faces many tight deadlines.
Yeah.
So, how can we shift the workplace and culture to prioritize well-being without sacrificing results?
Yeah, I think one thing that I really have noticed is that you can, in procurement, you can get involved in a lot of things and feel like it's your duty to get a lot involved in everything to help everyone and to almost be subservient. And one of the things that I've always advocated on is making sure you've got clear priorities, making sure that you're focusing on the things that are going to deliver the most value, but also offering a self-service framework to the business that enables those little projects, those bits, those distractions that you can actually say, do you know what, I trust you to go and procure following these frameworks. And I think procurement, therefore, we've got to think about, okay, where are we going to add the most value? I always feel like I get the most accomplishment from delivering on the big projects which are going to deliver the most value. And where the days when it gets difficult is when you feel like you've got multiple things coming in. And procurement individuals tend to want to say yes because we want to be helpful, or we want stakeholders are talking to us. But actually, a polite no with a, but here's where you can go, or here's, in a nice way, or here's where you can go and get templates that will help you, is as useful sometimes to stakeholders as constantly putting them on hold.
Yeah, I understand that. And, procurement is definitely one of those organizations within a company where everyone's coming at you, right? I mean, they want you to meet this deadline. You have a contract that has to be signed by tomorrow. Renewals are coming up at the end of the year. We need to find ways to save money, and everyone's going to procurement. It can definitely kind of make you feel bogged down, and you just feel like the work just keeps coming and there's no end in sight. What would you say for organizations that, like, or for going back to your leadership even, and saying like, hey, like, we're really busy, we're overwhelmed, we need help. Like, how can you ask for help without it seeming like a negative?
Yeah, and actually, I think it's a lot of it's about phrasing. And I was going to say, a good procurement function has a really solid activity tracker with a benefits plan attached to it. And if you feel like you look at that activity tracker and it's just not possible for you to be resourced properly, then you need to have the sensible conversations with your business, with your line management, wherever you report in, to say, here's what's coming up in the next quarter, here's what's coming up in H2. It's not feasible that we can deliver all of this. So you almost be proactive with them to say what are the ones that you see as the biggest priorities, involve them in the conversation so that you can almost get that direction, and then be very clear about what can be paused, or what should be paused, or what could be delegated. But also have the honest conversation around, if there is a genuine resourcing issue, maybe there's a resourcing issue that can't be helped by permanent, but maybe there's temporary,
Yeah.
interim solutions that can really help. So I think it's just having those really open conversations, but underpinning it with some data, so number of activities, what's coming up, what the benefits are, is really helpful.
That's great advice. So I would love to hear from our audience. Does anyone have any questions they would like to ask Tom or myself? Feel free to drop them in the chat. Just,
Tim, I think while you're waiting for those questions, just one thing I wanted to recognise is that in 2025, it feels like the pressure for procurement teams is even bigger. When you think about the all the things going on at the moment with trade tariffs, with global supply chain issues, with cybersecurity risks, there's even more things happening, which will actually mean that procurement are taking on more, and sometimes with less resource. So
yeah, I 100% agree. This is definitely a churn for procurement when it comes to all of the tariffs and just all the unknown. AI is another
yeah,
huge, thing that's impacting procurement organizations right now. So we do have a question. So talking about the financial repercussions from a retention standpoint, does it make sense for companies to put focus and energy on this?
yeah, and I think we talked about this a little bit earlier in terms of, I think that if the business culturally isn't necessarily that warm to the idea of focusing on how we alleviate stress and how we reduce the impact of burnout, then they need to be considering it from a financial impact. And I think that's a great point that's been raised. I feel like it's probably one of the biggest, perhaps underappreciated costs to a business, in terms of the impact of burnout doesn't necessarily show itself in any figures, because sometimes absences or people leaving isn't
Mhm.
actually, people aren't actually saying it's because I hit burnout, they're saying it's for something else. So
Right.
it's one of those hidden costs that I think is probably bigger than we can even possibly quantify.
Yep. Being in recruiting, like I said, it's expensive. It's definitely a financial burden to replace workers,
Yeah,
and so some organizations don't always understand how that hits your bottom line when you're
Yeah.
constantly having attrition. So another question we have that came in is prioritization of value projects over ad hoc requests. And so it's a must for any procurement team. Great suggestion on, oh, but it's actually more of a comment, but great suggestion on proactive and honest communication and leadership in the business we are serving.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really glad that Carlos has pulled that out though, and yeah, great to see Carlos on this because Carlos regularly supports my posts, so thanks, Carlos. I feel like it's one of the biggest factors for procurement teams is we try and get involved in everything, and I don't think that that's particularly helpful. I think a strategic procurement team, one that's functioning really well, gets involved in the high priority stuff, and I think the problem is, and one of the things that I'm a big advocate of, is just not getting distracted. Like the human brain realistically can really only accomplish a certain amount within a working day, within a working week, and you really prioritize those big 3 projects each week. That's where you get your sense of accomplishment. That's where you're going to deliver value. And I know it's easier said than done, but then having the honest conversations around what can be dropped, what can be delegated, and making sure that this framework's in place to help people is the key.
Great, thank you. We're getting ready to close up here, but before we drop, is there any final tips that you have for the audience, Tom?
Yeah, I think keep talking about it. I think Laura's just made a point here in the comments about it's great that companies are offering space to share these topics. There was a lot of challenges over the last few years with things like the COVID pandemic and what that led to in terms of the mental health challenges. But one of the positives I see is the fact that we're being much more open. And I know it can be difficult, people can feel afraid to be, but I would say be open, talk to people, and it doesn't have to be people within your business. There is a big network out there. So one of the things that I've really focused on over the last few years is building my network, and that is actually really important. Generally, we've all got the opportunity through things like, social media gets a lot of bad press, but actually I've built some really good positive communities through LinkedIn, through my newsletter, and I think there's more people out there who are ready to help than you perhaps may realize. So reach out to people, and yeah, reach out to me. I'd love if anyone's got any questions. I just think it's something we need to talk about, we need to be open about, and we need to be realistic about too.
Yep, I agree. And I think that being able to talk to people is, one of the greatest things that you can do and definitely will help you. And I know, Tom, you're probably a great source for that. We had one last question come in. I'll just ask it really quick, but what role
Yeah.
does procurement play in your digital transformation roadmap?
What role does procurement play in the digital transformation roadmap? Well, that's a big
Great
question, and I
question.
think, yeah, I was going to say that's probably more a general question, perhaps not necessarily related to this topic, but I would say it comes back to my point that procurement now has so many responsibilities, including the digital transformation roadmap. So if you think about it, there is so much going on. You mentioned it, Kim, AI, the technical upgrading across the businesses, that procurement is constantly involved in new investments. So the role that we play in the businesses is becoming much more fundamental, but as such, the workload and the pressures are becoming bigger. So yeah, big question, probably not one I could answer within a minute.
We need a whole topic on that
Yeah, yeah.
one. So, well, this was invaluable. Thank you so much, Tom. I hope that everyone can share this stream with your network. Please feel free to follow Procurability for more content and check out Tom's post on burnout. The link will be in the comments, and let's keep this conversation going.